Hello, good afternoon and welcome to this SPF Digital Series webinar entitled What's Next for the Carbon Agenda. My name is Robin Blacklock and I'm the Executive Chair of the Scottish Property Federation. Today we're going to look at our ambition to become a carbon neutral country and try to better understand what this means for the real estate industry in Scotland. I hope to host an interactive session, and in that respect please feel free to use the Q&A button on your screens and ask questions as we move through. I'll try to get through as many as possible over the next hour or so, and we'll try and wrap the discussion up before 1:30. In the meantime, we'll hear different perspectives from our panel of industry leaders. By way of a background, when I took the role of chair of SPF last November, I was clear that we as an industry needed to react to what was happening in wider society, to what was happening in Scottish Government, and to what was happening in business. We needed to recognise the importance of the twin challenges of social inclusion and carbon reduction. Over the course of the last year, I've kept these twin challenges at the heart of the discussions that I've had across our industry and with local and national government, and they've been central to the work of the Scottish Property Federation. As we moved through the current crisis, I held a genuine concern that these would be abandoned in favour of economic stability and in the search of an economic recovery at any cost. That has not been the case. In May, 200 leading UK businesses wrote to the Prime Minister, urging him not to relent on the goals of a carbon neutral economy and to continue initiatives to encourage social inclusion in any recovery plan. This has been echoed in Scotland, and Scottish Government haven't relented in their quest for inclusive economic growth as we move towards a carbon neutral economy. Benny Higgins' report on the recovery, entitled Towards a Robust, Resilient, Wellbeing Economy for Scotland, embraced these aspects. And the programme for government outlined in early September included a £100 million fund for green jobs, a £62 million for energy transition, and a number of other initiatives focused on decarbonisation. All of this is over and above the creation of the Scottish National Investment Bank, which Scottish Government has cited as being essential in the shift towards a greener economy. I don't think we can doubt Scottish Government's commitment on this subject. In our industry too, we're seeing a real awareness of the carbon agenda from occupiers and investors, and these are helping to inspire developers to create greener, more efficient buildings. Over the course of the next 55 minutes, we hope to explore many of these points, and to do this I'm joined by three industry leaders. First, we have Kat Feldinger from Scottish Government. Kat has worked on raising Scotland's profile in capital investment markets for the past 2 years, focusing on a one-team approach and working closely with investors and developers. She's recently taken up the challenge of uniting that work with the new Scottish National Investment Bank in a new division for investment markets and making those markets work for Scotland. This will, of course, have a strong focus on achieving a transition to net zero. We also have today Bill Richie, who leads a Tuller 10s operation in Scotland. Bill is passionate about this subject and has long been holding conversations and sharing his views through his various roles as the past chair and on the judging panel for the Scottish chapter of the BCO, on the SPF's Committee for Sustainability and Building Standards, and on the Scottish Committee for REVO. But first, let me introduce you to our first speaker. I first spoke with Marco Abdulla a couple of months ago, and he raised with me the concept called cradle to cradle. And it seemed so simple that I felt like, am I the last person to have heard about this? But I figured that some people out there may yet to hear about this concept, so I'm delighted that he's agreed to join us today to share a little bit more about that. Let me do a proper introduction. Marco Abdulla is a mechanical engineer with a passion for sustainability. He's had a career that's taken him from Stuttgart to Shanghai and now on to London. Marco works for Dries & Sommer, an international project management and engineering consultancy firm, focusing on topics from zero carbon to smart buildings. I'll hand over to you, Marco.
Thanks for the kind introduction. I would like to show you in the next 10 minutes why cradle to cradle is a very powerful approach to tackle climate change. You should now be able to see my screen. And would like to start with a look into the ecological footprint of our construction industry. Our buildings are responsible for around 33% of global carbon emissions. They consume around 30 to 40% of our energy. And that's why we know that we have a climate change problem in our industry. But on the material side, it's even worse. Our buildings consume around 40 to 50% of raw materials and are responsible for 60% of the total waste production in the UK. So we have a climate change and a material problem, and both are deeply connected. And that's what I want to show you in the next 10 minutes. So everyone is now talking about carbon, and every day so-called net zero carbon buildings are popping up, which in all cases I know are not zero carbon if you look on whole life carbon emissions of a building. And that's what matters, because it's the sum of operational carbon emissions and embodied carbon emissions over the entire life cycle of a project. Operational carbon emissions are obviously related to the energy we consume, heating, cooling, lighting, electricity, whereas embodied carbon is associated or related to materials we use. And that starts with the raw material sourcing process, the manufacturing process, transportation, installation on our construction sites, and at the end also the disposal. To understand the problem, we are using life cycle carbon assessments, which separate the life cycle of a building into different modules, from the production phase with the raw material sourcing and the construction, the module B, the use phase, which looks into the operation, and also the end of life when it comes to demolition or recycling of materials. Current regulations, however, only focus on, or mostly focus on, the operational part. We have done now a couple of carbon life cycle assessments across Europe, and we can see that in most cases, around 40 to 65% of carbon emissions are operational, and the other half, 35 to 60% of carbon emissions, are embodied carbon emissions. So if we now talk about net zero carbon buildings, and if we only address the operational carbon side, we only tell half the truth. Take, for example, a large-scale tower in London. At the point where we complete the construction, already 60,000 tons embodied carbon emissions have been produced or emitted. To compensate that, we would need to run a wind park with 17 turbines for 1 year. On the other hand, operational carbon emissions are around 5,000 tons every year throughout the entire life cycle of a project, and to compensate that, we would need to keep 2 wind turbines running throughout the project lifetime. Now we see a decarbonization of the grid, which helps to reduce the operational footprint over the next decades, but it has a very limited effect on embodied carbon footprint, because we import materials from other countries, and embodied carbon is instantly emitted at the construction. So we don't benefit here from a future decarbonization. Embodied carbon needs to be addressed urgently. If we look into a carbon life cycle assessment, we will see that carbon emissions over the entire life cycle of a building have that initial peak at construction and a relatively constant band of operational carbon throughout the entire lifetime of a project. Now, compared to operational carbon emissions, which can be simply addressed by energy efficient electric buildings, embodied carbon is a big challenge, because it is related to a very energy intensive raw material sourcing process. To give you an example, in 2018, the cement production was responsible for 8% of the global carbon emissions. The logical conclusion would be to reduce the amount of raw materials by using materials more efficient, or by building less, and the latter is not the global trend. Another solution brings us to circular economy, which can cut embodied carbon emissions by 45%, and that's a lot. So our mission now is to support project teams at the transition towards circular economy. We currently live in a world of linear economy. We take, we make, we waste. When we talk about recycling, in most cases we mean downcycling. If you take, for example, a window, if you recycle the window glass of a very high quality, it becomes likely a green beer bottle. And if you recycle that again, it becomes a brown beer bottle, and then it goes to the landfill, and we lose the raw materials and we produce waste. The solution would be circular economy, where the window as such would be designed in a way that all materials can become a new window in the second life, and then waste would not exist anymore. So we have to rethink the way we see and create our urban environment. And that starts from an urban to molecular level. We have to see our cities as material storage. I mean, we can add new materials into the storage, but we can also source raw materials from our urban environment to make new buildings or refurbish them. Those buildings have to be designed for disassembly. Products need to be recyclable. We need recyclability on component level, which very much depends on substance and molecule level, the chemistry behind our materials. It's not a theory anymore. We have completed a couple of cradle-to-cradle buildings across Europe, and I would like to show you two examples we currently work on. The first one is the Cradle in Düsseldorf. It's located in Germany, and it's named the Cradle because circular economy is the key theme throughout the entire design. We have an exterior timber structure. We have solid wood slabs and partition walls made of timber, which can sequester and store carbon emissions. And the important thing here is that it can be disassembled at the end of the lifetime, and parts can be reused or they can be recycled. To optimize and monitor the material performance in construction projects, we integrated parameters into a circular BIM model. And that digital tool helps to visualize, for example, recyclability, separability of materials, the healthiness of materials, embodied carbon. Everything is possible. And that is really important because we need to measure and monitor material performance, especially embodied carbon, if we want to improve it. All the information collected regarding materials are then stored in a project database, and that can be turned into a so-called building material passport. And this document is really crucial because it provides transparency, it provides facts about embodied carbon emissions of our project, about healthiness, recyclability, pollutants in our building. And this information can then be published on digital platforms such as Madaster, which allow to map resources inside an urban environment, which is the basis for urban mining, sourcing raw materials from existing buildings. I will come to that in a minute. And that will then also affect the financial value of an asset. And that's very important because we all know that in reality, sustainability approaches are only successful in a large scale if they are either enforced by regulations or if they come with an attractive financial business case. And this is what we see with cradle-to-cradle buildings because they are able to maintain a so-called residual value. If we take, for example, a property value of a conventional building, here in dark blue color, the positive property value after construction decreases with time and use. We can temporarily increase the value by renovations and repairs, but finally, at the end of the lifetime, we have a negative value. The building becomes a liability. There are costs for deconstruction. We have to pay for the landfill. Cradle-to-cradle buildings can be disassembled at that point, and the materials can be reused or recycled. We could principally sell them to other projects. And that means that we have the so-called residual value, which equals the raw material value of our buildings. So it's not just an investment in real estate, it's also an investment in raw materials. And that can be around 20% of the original investment, and that can be a game changer. Existing buildings play a key role when it comes to zero carbon targets. The main priority is here to maintain as much as possible of our existing building stock and change where necessary. That can be, for example, a facade where the savings in energy and the avoidance in carbon emissions can justify a replacement, which is related again to embodied carbon emissions. And we applied that principle of urban mining in the World Trade Center project in Brussels. Probably the largest circular economy project in the world with 110,000 square meter renovation area. And instead of sourcing raw materials from the other side of the world, we tried to extract as much as possible from the existing building. It's a massive task. It starts with an inventory where you need to estimate and calculate the existing material amount. We have to check recyclability of materials with laboratories who scan for pollutants and hazardous substances. and we have to establish storage and logistic concepts. That's what you see here on the photos, and to develop finally also agreements with the new suppliers. It's a lot of effort, but it's worth if you look on the result. In that case, overall, more than 95% of all existing materials will be recovered or recycled. We'd like to close the presentation with a view on the international market. We see hotspots in Europe, especially Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and the Netherlands, and it becomes now also a topic in the UK. And I believe that circular economy and embodied carbon is now really becoming part of very important regulations and frameworks, such as the European Taxonomy framework or the New Green Deal, because in the end, it is an approach for a sustainable growth in a large scale, and that's exactly what we need. Thanks for your attention.
Marco, thanks for that. That's very interesting. There's a number of things to flow from that. Just to give you a bit of a rest, Mark, I'll come to you, Bill. In general terms, how do you feel about the progress that we're making in Scotland against the carbon targets we've set? And I suppose more specifically linking into what Mark has been talking about, to what extent is the whole life recycling process that we've just heard about, to what extent is that considered in the design and specification stages of the projects that you're currently working on?
Thanks, Robin. Well, in terms of carbon reduction, I think as a nation, Scotland's made some incredible progress over the last 20 years. I think the physical changes are obvious. We've got rid of coal-fired power stations, wind turbines, and proliferate the countryside and PVs on many roofs. But there's still so very much to do. As we're talking about carbon agenda here, the Scottish Government have been very clear in terms of their aspirations and follows some of the UK and European policy making. The Climate Change Scotland Act, which was refreshed last year, set out some pretty ambitious targets. As a country, we wish to be a net zero carbon economy by 2045. And as part of that, we need a 75% reduction by the year 2030. Quite ambitious targets and quite laudable. I think where the confusion comes in is ad hoc policy, which can be brought in by planners in cities. And some of this may be political, but some of it with right aspirations or intentions in mind. But they do conflate and do confuse the overall targets that we're trying to achieve. In terms of the built environment, again, there's been some great progress in terms of new buildings. Non-domestic building stock has gone through some incredible changes over the last few years. Since EPCs were introduced back in 2007, we've made incredible strides in terms of reducing carbon emissions, operational carbon emissions from buildings. Unfortunately, I think the method of compliance, still this rather clunky SPM calculation, has served its purpose and isn't really advancing the advances that we've made in terms of good building design over the last few years. At the moment, we're still seeing the promotion of mechanical ventilated buildings, of comfort cooling systems, and these are all products of the method of compliance, which we basically have to use to demonstrate compliance with building control in Section 6. To your point, there's been absolutely no mention so far of embodied carbon in any of this legislation. I know that Section 6 is up for a refresh, and one of my colleagues is sitting on the advisory panel to that. And we're pushing hard that Marco's piece on embodied carbon, which we're starting to see from some clients, really starts to get embodied into that legislation. In terms of the new building, the domestic stock, I think it's an even poorer situation. The SPM calculations aren't even as advanced or as complex as the non-domestic. So good design in terms of lighting design or some lower zero carbon technologies just aren't recognised at all in some of the compliance software that we have to run. So we're ending up with buildings which are not as good as they could be, and leaving so much more to do for that new building stock. In terms of existing buildings, I'm afraid it's an even gloomier picture. The Section 63, which was introduced a few years ago, was late in its introduction and really just scratched the surface. Obviously, if we're to hit these targets by 70% reduction in carbon emissions or towards this carbon neutrality by 2030, we've really got to make some major inroads to the existing building stock. And at the moment, whilst that Section 63 again is up for another refresh, it doesn't appear to be making big enough strides or advances to get anywhere near the aspirations that the government is setting out. So the outcomes, a bit more to be done. There was an interesting report produced by the progress report to the Scottish Parliament last year, talking about reducing emissions in Scotland. And in the built environment, there's a recognition that actually carbon emissions have gone up in the years 2011 to 2016, which is a real sad testimony to the lack of progress we really are making, particularly on that existing building stock. On the macro level, I think the UK grid is struggling. And the inference is Scotland, whilst I think it's ahead of the UK, has still got a long way to go. And I think that's where, as a nation, we really need to be investing some money and making bigger change rather than trying to do too much on a building-by-building basis. There's a few apps you can get, and at 8:30 this morning, the UK energy needs were actually met, 40% of which by gas. Some of that gas being shipped from Qatar. Only 18% was coming from wind, 18% from nuclear. And we're actually importing energy this morning from France, the Netherlands, Ireland, and Belgium. So I think we really have to start asking ourselves, why are we not really getting on top of this and be able to green the grid and get on this roadmap, this target to this carbon neutrality? So I guess moving forward, I'd like to see some policy making aligned with the art of the possible, rather than penalising single building and developers to embody zero carbon technologies, which in city centre sites, we really are squeezing that art of the possible. We're putting in PV, putting in renewables as far as we can, but actually we're getting to a point where there's just physically not enough space or room to embody any more technologies. And actually we can only put in so much technology onto one building. The amount of money we generate by exporting that energy is a paltry 4 pence per kilowatt hour, or even less, which is a fraction of what we have to pay for new energy coming in off the grid. The compliance software, as I say, that should really take centre stage in terms of moving away from looking just at carbon, but let's get energy efficiency right. Let's start looking at energy and actual operational energy. And as Marco says, start to look at embodied carbon as we go with that. To make some real changes. So all of that, I think sort of it boils down to, I think, funding. I think we need to look at funding in terms of greening the grid. I think we need to start to reintroduce initiatives like the feed-in tariff, which were removed at the beginning of last year. We need to start getting grant funding to really incentivise and help people in this transition. So it's really significant transitions that we're being asked to make. And I think we have to start behaving differently. I think as landlords, as tenants, we should be starting to offer and demand green leases. As domestic users, we shouldn't be allowed just unmetered water consumption, as we will. That in itself is taking up energy and a valuable resource. And we should start to make some real connections between good building design and how that can really reduce carbon emissions. Nobody really wants to see buildings with energy-hungry building services. And that's quite a statement for somebody who spent a lifetime as a consultant designing building services.
Thanks for that, Bill. There's any number of things to pick up there. I'll come to you in a second, but you raised a point there, Bill, that I thought was really interesting around building regs, statutory consents, and so on. And one of my thoughts in my head was, are they a help or a hindrance? And is enough known about new technologies to allow us to embrace them? Quite clearly, I think you're making a point that either not enough is known about the technologies, or too much weight put in the current statutory regulations we've got. How do we go about changing that? How do we allow the statutory regulations to keep pace with some of this innovation that's coming through?
I think it's an overhaul of the SPM system. This standardised building energy assessment method is basically taking a notional building and comparing it with a new building. And it's easier to show progression from a very energy intensive building than it is from a green building. So the base point we always revert to is a building which is sealed and is comfort cooling and is energy hungry. We need to get a system in place. But I think Partel is starting to take, the English sort of calculation is starting to move towards recognising good, strong passive design credentials, mixed mode ventilation, and doing more with less. We're trying to design comfort cooling out of buildings, hungry, energy efficient, inefficient systems, trying to design them out. And actually, I think we'll need to get on board with that I think that's where the health and wellbeing agenda is going. I think that's where occupants want to go. But maybe we need to get the investment market, maybe some agents on board, where they start to see the progress that other parts, as Marco points out, other parts of the world are making. But we're in a part of the world which is inherently cool, it's got a temperate climate, and we should be using that to its best advantage, not putting in comfort cooling everywhere.
We'll come back to some of those points, but I just want to give you a chance to come in there. And I think Bill raised some interesting points about regulation and what government might do and so on and so forth. You're sitting in an interesting place between politics and application. As we project forward and look at policies and strategies, what shape is this going to take? Are we going to see the carrots of incentives and grants to improve the way we go about designing, building and using buildings? Or is it going to be the sticks of tax and regulation to increase the cost of inefficient buildings? What instruments are we predicting that government's going to use to try and incentivise us here?
So I suppose there's sort of a concrete and a conceptual answer to that. The concrete answer is that the things that I'm seeing coming out across the government tend more towards a kind of a soft approach. So there are kind of bit by bit changes in what the building regs say you have to do. There are bit by bit changes and sort of long signalled flagging points around changes to domestic boilers, all these kinds of things. Equally, there's kind of a bit of work also being done on taxes, not necessarily as a negative, but actually as a positive incentive. So we've had for a long time the sort of the rates exemption around new buildings. There's some work underway at the moment to think about whether that can be tailored specifically to, if you go further than the building regs, what kind of tax benefits essentially does that get you for developing in that way. I think there's quite a lot that we can do in terms of showing the way. Some of the things that we do through Scottish Futures Trust and the Hub's procurement model in particular for building public sector buildings. There's a whole host of the things that Marco was saying, where there's ideas pinging in my head around, God, I wonder how we connect the dots. Should not every public building be built in that way and sort of almost be the beginning, be the base load for urban mining? Could we do that? I think we've got a real opportunity actually over the next year in the kind of the run up to COP, where people are really, really focused on this and on wanting to kind of create some real showcases for how to do different things differently in Scotland, not just in Glasgow, across the country. I think there's also something quite interesting in the things that government does that are not kind of as direct as all of that. So Bill was making some points there around sort of grid and the enabling environment, and there's only so much you can do at project level. So actually, what can you do at city level, where we at the moment are doing a lot of work on kind of looking at what the heating systems in cities in particular are going to look like, how you bring more hydrogen into that, how you make much more of that kind of run from renewable energy. But again, that's kind of all on the operation side rather than on the embodied carbon. So I think you need to pursue all of it in one go. I think the other thing that we can do, and that I think we're starting to do across the Scottish Government, although I kind of probably in line with many others wish we could go a little bit faster on this, is that sense of creating cohesion. So you've now got an infrastructure investment plan for the next 10 years. You'll have a transport plan that falls out the back of that. There is work going on understanding where Scotland's best future economic opportunities lie for inward investment, for exports. There's the Scottish National Investment Bank launching with this big mission around reaching net zero. And actually what all of those are beginning to say is that we kind of know what it is that we're trying to build. We know what kind of economy and what kind of country we're trying to build. And increasingly, those are not just kind of missions for the Scottish National Investment Bank. They just are the thing that Scotland and the Scottish Government is trying to do, both through the economy and through specific projects. And then I suppose the final thought in all of this that was really sparked by what Marco and Bill were saying is that there is a real sense of personal leadership. I was at an event where Mark Carney spoke at the beginning of the year, where the quote he gave us was, "What was once slow and imperceptible is now at once overwhelming and remorseless." The time is now, right? We have absolutely no choice about this. If you build assets which are not built with this way of thinking behind them, they will lose more value. It is not worth your while. You have children in this world, probably, and you actually have to start taking some responsibility in your business and in your own actions for what that means, as we do in government. So when I sit here, I have 2 children too. So when I'm sitting here thinking about, God, what difference is this actually going to make? That drive towards it and that sense that we literally have a decade to turn this around. There is no more time. to procrastinate and prevaricate. We have to do this now. And we actually have to use that run up to COP, I think, really, really powerfully to try and mobilize that sense that it is government, it's individuals, it's businesses, it's all of us, understanding that this is both a threat and a real opportunity for us to turn it around.
A little less conversation and a little more action.
That'd be great.
Marco, from your perspective, you've worked in Germany, you've spent some time out in China. We have a variety of different views as to what's happening out in China, but a couple of questions. A, what is happening in China? Are they leading edge of this, or are they going to be the real constraint on having a less carbon in the world? And secondly, which are the countries that are making the biggest strides in this, and how are they going about it?
I think what we have seen in China was that sustainability was starting to become a topic, indeed, especially for certain clients who made it part of their own business as well. I think that was then a corporate understanding, and it was serving a corporate purpose. It was not a duty for them. And I think what was impressive there was how fast the government can react, and how strong those measures take place in the end. We see in Germany, for example, that things partially go very, very slow because they have passed very many gates before a regulation is launched, and that takes time. And the problem is that urgency we see in the topic, because the buildings we design today, they will be built in 5 or 7 years. So we always have that delay. And if we have targets which kick in 2030 or 2045, that's not too far away anymore. So everything we do now is directly affecting that target. So there is no time we can waste anymore. And I think what we see in Europe, there are some countries, for example, the Netherlands, they, I think, committed themselves to be 100% circular. So they committed the entire economy towards circular economy, because they see also a huge market benefit, because we are dependent on materials. We have to import materials, and there is a big opportunity as well. If we don't need to source them and bring them in from other countries, we can source them at our home. That makes us independent, and it has an economical benefit. So I'm rather, I think, seeing benefits as an encouraging a change than having restrictions forcing a change. And I think the public sector can help to establish pioneering technologies. They can help to reduce the fear of new approaches, because the real estate industry is very risk averse. It's a big commitment, it's a big investment. So investors, they rather don't want to take too much risk. And if we would have public buildings which can be used as a showcase that it is possible and it's feasible, that can encourage others to follow.
Thanks for that. We've got a related question to all the panelists. I'll probably come to you in this one first, Bill, from Alan Somerville, who knows a bit about these things. There is a spider's web of related policy issues which have been mentioned, some of which are UK government, some Scottish government, and some local government. Realistically, the policy agenda isn't going to drive change, but more likely to support changing behaviours. As an industry, should really stop over-specifying buildings and start designing buildings which actually perform the way they were designed. Focus on our time on delivery rather than debating the rhetoric.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. I think there's much to be said for overcomplicating the method of compliance and actually look at the physical outcome. And as part of this, it's not just about getting the building right, but we have to start looking at, it's about behaviour, which I think Alan's mentioning here. It's about looking at how we use that unregulated energy, because carbon neutrality as defined by the LETI guide or by UK Green Building Council, it sets metrics for not just the regulated, which we can control in the first part of the building, but it's how people use that energy and how they behave. So there's, I think, more of a focus on the outturn values and the outturn energy consumption rather than really sweating the small stuff and the detail of how we get there. I think that will follow. Good building design is intuitive. We've been doing it for thousands of years without intensive energy usage and carbon emissions. We can get back to that just by, as I say, using the environment more and changing our behaviour a bit.
So it's not deregulation, but is it maybe just a more, or what would the term we would use, agile environment of regulation
Agile, looking at maybe display certificates, looking at energy rather than carbon. The two of them are intertwined, there's no question of that. But the policymakers can tweak the amount of carbon they associate to gas and electricity, and that's flip-flopped in favour of gas and electricity over the last 10, 15 years. It's that policy making which makes building design very difficult. And we need to get, I think it needs to come down to look more at the outturn and product and try and focus on that.
Can I come back to you a second, just on your role, as recognised over the past couple of years, you've been dealing with a lot of international investors, a lot of people speaking about coming to Scotland. Are our stated aims on carbon neutrality a positive? Is that attracting investors? Are they driven to come here because of our green credentials? Or is it the opposite? Are some put off coming here because we're not doing enough? Or actually, do they not care?
So multiple part answer to a multiple part question. So I think when I started sort of 2.5 years ago, certainly investors in the real estate world were, I think I would politely term it, a little bit behind the curve in terms of thinking about some of these things. There was a model, I suppose, particularly in the UK, that really kind of works around, here are the rent models that we use. It's kind of very fixed. You're almost guaranteed a return, et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of where the focus was. And thinking about the sort of the bigger issues around environmental well-being didn't really figure on their radar. By contrast, I think there have been a set of investors around infrastructure, around technology, that are much, much further along this curve, and who have really led the way on sort of impact and ESG investing. And what I would say over the past year is that I've increasingly seen those two streams of thought merge. So there are now, partly because of a COVID and partly because of a series of projects becoming more viable, more investable, essentially because of underlying technology changes. There are a series of investors who before would have gone, that environment stuff's not really for us we don't really care, who now are sort of saying, oh, no, okay, our shareholders our investors behind the scenes are asking for this as well. We'd better start moving in this direction. I think where that gives us a real opportunity for Scotland is we need to get the project pipeline up and running. We need to have many, many more projects. And I think with the kinds of changes we want to see coming through in the climate change plan, for example, you've got stuff around transport, around hydrogen, around heating, around the list is just endless of the things that we need to somehow get constructed in order to change the environment, which then changes it for individual projects in our city centres. The other thing I guess I would say to that in terms of it being off-putting is that I don't care. There are trillions, literally trillions of dollars of assets looking for a place to land, who have not been able to do so much over the crisis. I think the best thing we can do as a nation is send out a really strong signal of these are the areas and this is the type of investment where we're interested in intersecting with the market. The clearer a signal you send on that, the more likely you are to find the investment partners that want to work in the same way. If we go after the ones who want to pilot high and build them cheap, then that's what we'll end up with. And that's not what I'm looking for the country I live in.
I suppose, so that takes macro international. I suppose, Indigenous companies, Bill, you've got a lot of clients, locally based clients. What's their approach? Is this on the agenda for them, or are you having to drag them kicking and screaming to the table to have these discussions, or is it something that is a natural part of a design process?
I think it's increasing in influence and popularity. You just have to look at the participants today and the engagement in the subject matter just to gauge that, the dial is moving and moving quite rapidly, and people are definitely understanding that. I think tenants are asking for more from the buildings, and we need to build space which offers that and competes on a UK and worldwide stage. So definitely seeing a big upturn in inquiries in this sector, in this field.
Mark, you used earlier the example of the building in Germany. Forgive me, I forget which city, but the one where you've taken a cradle-to-cradle approach from the outset. Clearly, there has to be an additional cost in that process. how do you get over that? How does that conversation come through? Is there an incentive from local and national government? Is it an investor who's prepared to be, I suppose, slightly philanthropic to learn? How do you get these projects, the exemplars that we all need to learn from, how do you get them up and off the ground and running so that CAT can then have a programme for public buildings in Scotland to follow that model, and then Bill can take any number of BCO tours around these buildings to understand from them? How do you get the first half dozen up and running that allow us to learn?
I think when we approach a client, I mean, of course, they're all fascinated. They love the idea of cradle to cradle building. But then the second question is, what's the business case behind it? And because in the end, somebody has to pay for it. And I think for us, the breakthrough was really to show that there is an economic benefit. You have a residual value. And we then had discussions on how that affects the business case of today, because the answer was, well, but then that happens in 60 years or in 80 years, I can sell parts of my buildings, but what about today? And there are, I think, ways how to include that into the equation of calculating the asset performance, and that it also becomes an impact on the business model today. And that was for many clients then really the reason why they followed it. Of course, it's still pioneering. Often we do kind of pilot projects where they want to explore it. In some countries, we see that there are tax benefits. I think in the Netherlands, for existing buildings, there are benefits. When you look into recycling strategies and when you spend effort on trying to find ways how to retain building fabric, it will be it is partially subsidized by the government. So I think it always comes down to the business case, or in most cases. And I think there are, I think, also new topics with the European taxonomy, investor risks, and so on. And I think embodied carbon is addressed, as well as circular economy. So I believe that we will see a strong change in the next few years in that topic as well.
Please do keep your questions coming either through the chat function or the Q&A. We've got one that kind of links into this, and very quickly from Alan Robertson. Bill, should there be a tax on demolishing buildings, thus encouraging deconstruction, I think was a term that you used, Marco, deconstruction as opposed to demolition?
I'm not big on taxing per se. I think the carrot's better than the stick. To that, I think it's quite interesting. Scottish Enterprise and Scottish Government are actually sponsoring some projects to look at reuse and deconstruction of certain building types. We were involved with a project last year which looked at industrial units to see how you could reuse these. Probably one of the more simple types of buildings, which is a sum of some components which you should be able to take down, rebuild, and build somewhere else or extend. And I think it comes down to good design, and that goes for really most building types. The ability to reuse that building. We're doing looking at an office just now, which is the first time we've actually looked at how do you take that building and repurpose that in the future to maybe residential or some other purpose. That doesn't need to be something you need to tax at the end of its life, but actually build something in using the embodied carbon that Mark was talking about, looking at getting those into the regs so that we do have buildings which are fit for purpose and not just for the 25, 30 year life of the cladding.
Good design. I suppose the ultimate recycling is just reusing a building. Edinburgh's Newtown's a great testament to that, I think, how it's evolved over the years. Just coming around to, I suppose, that same question linked in with viability and how we get these projects up and running. Putting your Scottish National Investment Bank hat on, I think we're all eagerly awaiting to see what shape this is going to take and when it finally takes off. Is that the sort of lending platform that will price favourably into demonstrably green projects, or will it be more competitive than perhaps a conventional lender into projects which meet this agenda?
So I think the big thing that the Scottish National Investment Bank can offer here is patience. So where you would, as part of your capital stack, have a kind of a series of debt or mezzanine products that kind of have to be repaid relatively quickly, Scottish National Investment Bank, while it will operate on commercial terms, will have a kind of a higher risk appetite than you might see from conventional finance suppliers, and it will have a much longer time horizon. So some of the things that we are looking at in their investment pipeline at the moment won't have a return for the Scottish National Investment Bank for kind of 20 years, and that's part of the plan here. I mean, this is kind of a 70 to 80 year operating plan essentially for a bank on the basis that we understand that we need to go in and support some of these things to get off the ground. I also think one of the other areas we're talking a lot about in Scottish Government at the moment that we just don't make enough of is procurement. We procure goods, not services, goods worth £11.6 billion a year just from the Scottish Government. A huge amount of that is delivered via the Scottish Futures Trust hubs, so things like the future schools, hospitals, all that kind of thing. We should be leading the way. As you said, there's a huge role for the public sector in sort of modelling some of these behaviours and testing the technology. And following this conversation, I'm going to go and have some conversations about it because I think we need to make it happen.
Well, you've been involved with British Council for Offices, REVO, which deals with shopping centres. You're pretty well covered across all the sectors. Is public sector buildings the right way to lead the charge here? Or can the private sector do more? What conditions would make it easier for the private sector to improve the credentials?
I think public sector has been responsible for driving a whole lot of initiatives. It's been certainly at the forefront of bringing forward processes like building information modelling, BREEAM assessments, for example. And we're seeing that now in terms of, certainly in the school environment, we're seeing a move towards Passive House and really embracing some of the more forward-thinking design measures, maybe some more expensive if we go the full hog with Passive House. The intent is there, and I think again, public sector is certainly not been slow in trying to drive some change through the construction industry.
Mark, it struck me when you were talking earlier in your presentation that actually, and I suppose I referenced Edinburgh Newtown, a lot of what you were commenting on was actually refurbishment, renewing, regenerating existing rather than just throwing away and building. Is this not just a wider reflection of what we should all be doing with whatever it is that we use? Is this just not just taking whether it's washing machines or widgets and extrapolating it up into buildings and the built environment?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think the cradle to cradle or circular economy movement started not in the real estate sector. It started on product level 30 years ago, where chemists tried to develop products which can be recycled. That can be, for example, a washing machine, what you mentioned, and that changes then also the entire ownership model of products. There's no point in owning actually a washing machine. You just want to have the service, and it should actually be that the company who sells you the washing machine stays the owner, and then they take it back, and then they automatically develop an interest to what happens at the end of the life cycle, because they want to get the raw materials back to make a new washing machine, which they lease to you. So, and this is something we currently see, and I believe that the industry is leading that. I think real estate is a step behind, but it's on a larger scale, so you can have a larger impact. That's why I believe that circular economy must be a part of our real estate sector.
And clearly in that context, the Internet of Things, whatever that means, smart buildings, components, buildings that talk to you about how they're being used, about how they're using energy, that clearly has an integral part to play in this sort of assessment of buildings. Is that becoming more prevalent? Are we seeing that become much more of a thing?
Definitely. I think if you deal with materials, it's a huge amount of data also in the project, and you need to handle that. And therefore, we have now digital models of our buildings. We have platforms where we can share information with the public and so on. And that's really a driver, especially modular building. And BIM is a huge booster of circular economy, and I think generally of material sustainability.
Are you able to capture that feedback from the buildings that you've been involved with, Bill? Do you get that sort of feedback? Well, we've actually been seeing that from our colleagues in the States in terms of embodied carbon analysis. It's something we've been doing maybe now for 5 years. more recently in London, and it's now coming certainly in spades in the local market here in Glasgow and Edinburgh and Scotland. There is a certain benefit, and people are starting to ask about the benefits of retaining the structure and just what does that mean in terms of saving of operational energy. And we're seeing typical savings, free running as an example, maybe 30, 40, 50 years. If you're able to save the concrete structure and the envelope, you're getting that sort of life of basically free operational carbon by saving that building. So clients are certainly asking for that analysis. They're seeing the benefits of that and using that to pitch to clients to say that, yes, retaining the structure is inherently the more sensible way to go.
I'm very conscious of time, and I'm not willing to run over. Just as a final question for everybody, and lighten it up a little bit, I suppose. I think we recognise that there's macro and there's micro, and I think fundamental to all this, we all need to make changes. We need to make changes in our own individual lifestyles if we're going to start hitting the targets that we've set for ourselves. Just individually, what's the one change you're going to make over the next 12 months to start shifting the dial, either personally or professionally? What's the one thing that you've got targeted to do to start reducing your footprint? Bill, because you're not on mute, I'm going to come to you first.
I think working from home is really, letting me see a whole new way of working that I just didn't think was possible. I thought people working from home were pretty much having a day off, but actually it's a very productive way of getting through your work without the carbon footprint of battling your way through the rush hour. So I think probably more of a mix between working from home, working in the office, and certainly a few red-eye flights to London to meet colleagues. There'll be a lot more of this going on.
Thanks, Bill. Kat, what's your change?
So I've got one kind of professional around making sure that the run up to COP is littered with just brilliant case studies of how we actually do this stuff in Scotland. I think the demonstrator effect is going to be hugely important over the next couple of years. And personally, I guess I'm trying to build one of them. So I'm in the process of turning my Victorian house into a Scandinavian eco building.
Sounds slightly incongruous. Good luck. Marco, what's your change? What are you going to do?
Well, I'm looking to buy a recyclable rain jacket so that I can cycle to work and I don't need a car anymore. That's my personal target.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to wrap things up slightly early, just to allow you all to go away and get a sandwich. But it's a difficult one to sum up this, but I think there's a number. I think the cradle to cradle approach is, as I said at the outset, when I heard it, it just kind of, why aren't we all doing that? And there's something really simple about that approach and looking at things that way. But there's no question about it. The viability, the cost that goes with that, I think, is difficult. I'm really encouraged as to how inspired Kat seems to be by that and taking that into the public sector and perhaps bringing it through that way. Bill's made some great comments about where the constraints are, the regulatory system, the statutory consents. Perhaps we need to be more agile there, and I'm pretty sure through Bill's involvement with the various trade bodies and the like, we'll start to see those changes, or certainly try and influence those changes. Deconstruction as opposed to demolition, I like that. It's a much more productive way about how we look at how we use buildings at the end. Another term I quite liked was urban mining. It gives you all sort of connotations of video games and the like. But I hope you as an audience have taken something from this. It's inspired to think about things in different ways and how we might design and use buildings in the built environment in the future. But all that remains for me to say is thank you to all of you for joining us. Thanks to Marco, Catherine, and to Bill for your input. And look out for the next SPF Digi Series, which I think is programmed for late November. But that's after the end of my tenure as chair. So I'm not going to worry too much about that. But do look out for it. Thank you all.
Thanks very much. Thank you.